recording now. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Mingji. Today, I'm facilitating the cultural storytelling talk. Every Sunday at 1300 GMT, we get together online to share and learn our cultural stories through food, history, travel, objects, and inspiring people stories. Our speaker today is Ann from London. For some of us, we met Ann a couple of times before as a speaker, as audience. For those who are new to Ann, Ann has a very long history and career trading and researching antique textiles. In recent years, she's been delivering talks on textile and guiding visitors to the wonderful textile collection at London's Victoria and Albert Museum. For those who haven't been to the museum, London's Victoria and Albert Museum is the world's largest museum of decorative art and design. Its collection spans 5,000 years of art from the culture of Europe, North America, Asia, and North Africa. So let's welcome Ann to give us a talk about some of her favorite objects in the Victorian and Albert Museum.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me back, Minji. Really pleased to be here. This isn't a talk I've given before, so I basically just had to think about some of my favorite things, and I ended up with a very long list. So I've cut it right back because once I started researching each piece, I had so much to say about it. So it's going to be a very short list, I'm afraid, not representative of the museum at all, but just a few of my favorite things. Can you put the screen up?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can everybody see the screen now?
That's it. Lovely. Yeah, as Minji said, it's from the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's a museum I've been visiting for many, many years. And in fact, one of the objects I'm talking about today was one of the very first things I saw in this museum. So the first object, how old do you think these socks are? If you put the answer in the chat section, anybody want to have a guess how old these objects might be, these socks?
So, and I will need you to monitor the chat record.
Yeah, I am actually, yeah. While you're thinking about it, I'll tell you, oh, good guess, Naomi. Well, I'm not trying to prejudice anybody. While you're thinking about it, I'll tell you what technique they're called. It's null binding or null binding. Probably terrible pronunciation. It's something that came before knitting, a technique, and it's sort of like knitting with one finger and one needle. But we've had, oh yes, oh, William, very close, very close. I've given it away now. These socks are 4th to 5th century AD. So they're around about 1600 years old. I mean, they're amazing condition considering that. They just look like they're knitted with stocking stitch, but it is this nail binding technique. They were found in Egypt at the end of the 19th century, and a lot of textiles, early textiles, are found in Egypt because the very hot, dry conditions, particularly in tombs, preserves textiles. So whenever you see Egypt mentioned, it doesn't mean to say Egypt was the center of textile production particularly, but they think this was found on a site of a monastery. And they weren't weird two-toed people, of course. It was for sandals. So they were very unfashionable people wearing socks with sandals, I'm afraid. What's interesting about this, they're made from wool. What's interesting is knitting and this nail binding were the first techniques that had sort of elasticity to them, and so that they could be fitted to the human body. So like socks and gloves and so on. And compared to cloth that you just draped around you, which is why it was so popular. It's more time consuming than knitting, this technique, and it's still made in Scandinavia. If you go to YouTube, the source of all information about textiles. You can see demonstrations of many techniques on YouTube. And there's people doing nail binding, so you can see it in action. I was told that there's a Finnish proverb that if you want to get a good wife in Finland, you should pick one who knows nail binding rather than knitting, because it's a stronger technique, so you get stronger gloves and socks and so on. So if anyone who fancies a Finnish husband, that's the way to go. I know, ridiculous, isn't it? Thank you. So I just wanted to quickly say a little bit about, yeah, they do look like Vikings. They do, don't they? Well, in fact, that's obviously how it all came about. Socks, when you think of museums, museum collections, in the past, museums concentrated on the most beautiful, exquisite, prestigious items that they collected. But over the last 100 years, and particularly in the last sort of century, they've followed the tradition of history from below, looking at the lives of everyday folk, and they collect much more, more socks, many items of everyday wear in their collections. And the V&A collects all the time. They're always going around collecting things. And so I just quickly grabbed some photos of some of the things in their collection. Socks are particularly good because they're such an everyday item, and you can really see how societies treat different items by looking at these. The top left are machine knitted socks. They're pretty old, and if you look at the little etching there, that's from the 1700s, and that's a machine to knit socks. And this machine was first patented, or tried to be patented, in 1587, so by William Lee. And when you think of the Industrial Revolution, you think 1700s, 1800s. But he invented this in 1587, which is so early. And in fact, he went to Queen Elizabeth I and asked for a patent, and she refused him because she said, it will ruin the livelihoods of some of my poor subjects. So she was a Luddite. She wouldn't let him have a patent on it. I won't go into details about all the others. The black and white ones are men's. The tartan ones are from the Great Exhibition, 1851. Then there's some Turkish socks. I love the grey ones on the end because I've knitted socks on a couple of occasions and they've looked exactly like that when I've knitted them. They're not mine, but it looked like it. We've got two other pairs, and we've got Mary Quant, who socks, very, very popular, and Sock Shop, which was a huge revolution in selling socks and spread around the world. And of course, the Japanese tabi socks as well. So very, very comprehensive collection of socks. It's a great thing with the internet now that you can go online and just look for some subject. And there you go. So on to something, we've looked at something quite everyday, but now we're going to look at something very spectacular. So this is my second one. This is Opus Anglicanum. And Opus Anglicanum means English work. And as you can see from the screen, it's saying it's English medieval embroidery. And this picture's from an exhibition they had about 6 years ago at the V&A. It's absolutely spectacular. In fact, they produced a book based on it. And Opus Anglicanum was an type of embroidery that was at its peak between 1250 and 1350. And this piece here is from that period. Well, we're going to look at one piece in more detail now. It was mainly worn by vicars, popes, bishops, and so on, ecclesiastical vestments, but it was also on heraldry, used for heraldry, so on horses and on costumes for knights. But that only the very the stuff that was used in heraldry all got ruined because they were running around in the playing, fighting. So it's mainly the ecclesiastical pieces that remain. So this work was a form of embroidery, and it was made mainly in London and in professional workshops, but they weren't attached to a monastery. So they were secular workshops near the City of London, near St. Paul's Cathedral, because obviously they were their clients, And men and women worked in these workshops. And at this exhibition, they'd found a document showing names of some of these people. And they had the names all around the sort of upper part of the walls, which was very interesting. And they did a 7-year apprenticeship. And so this is an example. So the object we've just been looking at is what's called a cope, which is a cape in effect. And I found this lovely picture of this bishop. He's an American gentleman, actually, I think from Philadelphia. I just found it on the internet to show you a cope in action. So that's the sort of thing that he would have worn. And I think this on the right, I think I showed you one of these previously in a previous talk, and that's a cope chest. And a cope chest is a chest where they keep coats in the cathedral. And if you go to any English cathedrals, always keep an eye out for these chests, because they date from 1300s, that sort of period quite often. They're very ancient chests. And that's where they kept these precious, highly expensive vestments. So this is the piece we're going to look at. The V&A has many of them, but we'll just look at this one. And this is called the Sion cope. And Sion's just to the west of London, and it's got its name because the nuns in a nunnery there preserved this cope. And what happened when Henry VIII set up the Church of England, there was a Reformation, we gave up very ornate religious services, and all of this stuff was either destroyed or hidden away by Catholic families or taken abroad. And these nuns moved to France. They fled to France, and they took this with them. They eventually brought it back in the 1800s. So that's how this beautiful coat was preserved. So this piece dates from 1310 to 1320. So it's a very, very beautiful ancient piece of embroidery. You can see on it, it's showing scenes from the life of Christ and the Virgin Mary. And in fact, there's a couple of priests in the corner as well, and some angels, and seraphim and so on. So it's showing the scenes from the Bible. And when you think of it, the bishop or whoever would be wearing it while he's conducting mass, and he would have his back to the congregation. So they would be looking at the back of this. And most of the people in the congregation wouldn't have been able to read or write. So this was a very important visual representation of their religion. This gave you something to do during a sermon, I should think as well. So we'll look at it in a little bit more detail now. So this is just a little section of it. You can see why it was so famous, this type of embroidery, was it was very high quality materials. A lot of the materials were imported from Italy, the Middle East, and so on, the silks and the metals. Very naturalistic. If you look at the faces, if you can see close up, they're very fine shading. It's by using split stitch for any needleworkers listening. They call it acupictura, means needle painting. And the other thing it's famous for is the gold and silver threads that are a part of it. It's not very clear on this picture, but there's a lot of silver that would have sparkled in candlelight on these threads. And they lay the threads on top of the work and just hold them in place with little stitches. The other thing is these quatrefoil, these panels, they're each sort of figures within one of these panels, and that's often shown in Gothic architecture. It's very similar sort of thing. The other thing that this particular cope is famous for is the background. So that's the green and the orange. It would have been red originally. And although it looks like a woven material, it's not. It's all very, very fine stitchwork. So the whole of the cope is covered in this immensely fine stitchwork. You can hardly see it. It just looks like a herringbone material when you look at it in real life. Absolutely amazing. What's the next one? So just a couple of quick look at a couple of details. The sort of band at the bottom is heraldic devices, but it doesn't relate to anything. They think it's just decoration. Normally, like your family would have its own shield, but they couldn't trace any sort of links with the family for this. You've got George and the Dragon, St. George, George and the Dragon, saying the dragon in the big picture there. And on the right, you've got a couple of scenes. The top one is apparently the death of the Virgin Mary. And the bottom one is Doubting Thomas. So there's all sort of biblical scenes around. Minge is asking, how long does it take to make a coat? A long time with a lot of people. Very, very, very expensive work. You imagine that background. It would have taken a team of people to make something like that. These are exquisite. And they wore them for hundreds, yeah, I bet. They wore them for hundreds of years, not individually. I'd like to wear something for hundreds of years. They passed it down. So when you're looking at, I did talk about the field of cloth of gold in the 1500s, they were wearing those coats to the field of the cloth of gold because they just got them out for ceremonial occasions, kept them in the coat chest and got them out for ceremonial occasions. So they were preserved because they were so valuable, so important. And it's all about magnificence. And before we leave this subject, I just wanted to quickly show you this, because if we're thinking about textiles, we're not looking at them in isolation. We're thinking about how they fit into the society in which they were made. I mean, they represent that society. And you look particularly for these at Gothic, because they're Gothic pieces. So you have Gothic architecture, you have illustrated books, stained glass, things like that. And you can see the same images and the same themes running through these. So bottom right there is the front of Wells Cathedral in Somerset. And it's difficult to see from this picture, but you've got a very similar, it's wonderful, Wells. You've got the whole hierarchy of religion there. So you have God at the top, Christ, the apostles, and then down the sides, you've got all the saints. And when you go through the door at the bottom, that's your place. You're at the bottom of the pile. So it's a visual representation of your religion, really. Amazing. And the one on the top, on the left there, the other bit of architecture, that's Bath Abbey. And I was there recently, and I always love this picture because this is on the front, and it's on both sides of the front of the Abbey. And you've got the stairway to heaven. So God's at the top, and you've got the sinners who've died coming up and down. So you've got most people climbing up to heaven, but if you look, the third one down is coming downhill. So he's on his way to hell. So that's a warning as you enter the church. And this is exactly the same messages you're getting from the textiles. The stained glass window, very similar. And the illustrated manuscript at the top, in the letter, it's got one of these quatrefoil shapes, just the same as the textile. So it's just a reminder that you should look throughout everything in the, when you're looking at textiles, look at all the other sort of decorative arts of the period. So if anybody wants to ask questions as we go along, please feel free to in the chat box. Okay, so my next favourite person here, it's an individual. I'm not sure she's one of my favourite people per se, but her embroidery I'm very fond of. Mary, Queen of Scots. And the V&A has got a marvellous collection of her embroideries. And in fact, there's Oxburgh Hall in Norfolk has also got a lot, and there's some in Scotland as well. So she produced a huge amount of embroidery. She was a very keen needlewoman. And she lived, for those who don't know, she lived from 1542 to 1587. What, this one? Is this a vest? No, it isn't. It's a panel. I'll be talking about it in a minute. It could be a vest. I mean, the point was they used to make these panels. You could put them on anything. So it could have been a vest. You're right there. Okay, so she lived 1542 to 1587. And she fled to England in 1568 and was imprisoned by Elizabeth I for nearly 19 years until she was executed in 1587. And during her imprisonment, she made a lot of this needlework. She wasn't imprisoned in a dungeon. She was living in a castle with an entourage and a personal chef and pets and all sorts. So she was treated as a queen, but she was obviously imprisoned. and she did a lot of this needlework. And what I find really interesting about this needlework is she used it politically. She used it to make statements about her condition. And she did it also with her ladies in waiting and with Elizabeth Talbot, who's actually better known as Bess of Hardwicke, who was an amazing woman. Bess of Hardwicke was the wife of her jailer, the Earl of Shrewsbury, the chap who was commissioned to look after. Okay. You're asking about, did the maker sign her work? If it's the Opus Anglicanum, no, it was all anonymous. If you're asking about Mary Queen of Scots, she did sign. There's some of that, she has a sort of cipher, and on some pieces she signed it, on some Elizabeth Talbot signed it. So, but the other ladies in waiting would have signed it. But it's very difficult to tell which bits generally she did by herself or, you know, in conjunction with other people. There's a lot of the needlework. Some pieces she signed. If you look at this piece, the red border at the bottom and top, there's tiny little marigolds, and that's one of her symbols, the marigold. But when I was talking about how she gives these hidden messages, there's mottos, these are in Latin, on this. And this one, it says, let me find it. Sorrow passes and hope abides. So she's making a message about that. And also in the corners, you've got the 4 emblems of the Royal Coats of Arms of England, France, Scotland, and Spain. Now, she claimed to be queen of all of those. I think Elizabeth I disagreed with her about who was Queen of England. But this was one of the claims she was making, you see. So she's saying, I'm the rightful queen. I'm in this difficult position, but I'm courageous. It's sort of courage in adversity, she's saying. So this is a sort of hidden messages she's making in her needlework. This is the second one. This one was made in about 1585, I believe. And this is called Marion Hangings. And I don't know if you can see, but it's a giant hand coming down from the heavens with a scythe, and it's cutting a vine. And what she's saying with this one is that the motto is virtue flourishes by wounding. So what she's saying is Elizabeth's line of succession is finishing with Elizabeth, and I will take over, which happened because her son did become king. But so she's sort of threatening Elizabeth, pruning the vine, pruning Elizabeth's line of succession. Yeah, I know. It is wow. She was very expressive, but it was more than expressive. She sent this to the Earl of Norfolk, who was the chap who was eventually executed for being part of her plot to escape. So she was rallying her troops, in effect, supposedly, with these hidden messages. There's lots of pieces in her collection, and they made these little squares, and they call them slips. So like when you're asking about the vest, they were small pieces that you could work in your hand, and then some needlewoman, you know, a servant would put them together, did the boring work. They did the, you know, interesting work of holding just a little piece and doing small. And they used these wonderful books that existed in that period of natural history with illustrations. So that this was a time of exploration and people discovering the world. And they were illustrating these books to show people the wonders of the world. And it's the equivalent of David Attenborough. And so you have these wonderful illustrations that they've copied. So you can see a quail and a peacock, and that's a cuckoo bottom in the middle, and a magpie. So very, very interesting birds here. And it wasn't just birds. They did all sorts of animals as well. So yeah, so this is some of the fish. So your top left is a flying fish. I think it's quite cute. All the names are in Latin, for the books are in Latin. The books are on, some of the books are online. There's a wonderful book by Conrad Gessner called, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is online. The illustrations for that period, for the 1500s, are amazing. So that right-hand one is a hammerhead shark. But of course, the thing was, they didn't specifically know everything. You had all the seamen's tales coming back saying, you know, they're mermen. So this bottom one is a merman. So they weren't quite sure which of these creatures were real and which weren't. I love that merman. Right, I just wanted to show you this one. So this is one of the books that they would use for their inspiration. And it's called Icones Animalium Aquatilium, possibly, which in English is Pictures of Aquatic Creatures. So, and it's an amazing book, and it's online. It was compiled in 1560. Very, very detailed illustrations, and you can see that she's copied it here, but she didn't know the name of it. It's a sea urchin, Echinops, but so they call it a boatfish, which I think is a wonderful name for a sea urchin. And this is the last one. There were many more I could have chosen, but I just chose a selection of the animals from her, from all these slips. There are many, many more. These are some of the most amazing ones. The one on the left is in Scotland. It's in Holyrood. And it's one of the most famous ones. And it says a cat, which is spelled C-A-T-T-E. And this was, again, Mary making a little point, because it's a great big ginger cat, which Elizabeth first was ginger-haired. And it's a little, I don't know if you can see, the picture's not very good, but it's a little grey mouse. And the cat is taunting the little grey mouse, which is supposed to be Mary. So it's saying, I'm being tortured by this giant creature. So she was making her point there. There's a lovely little monkey. The dog in the centre bottom is really cute. That's Jupiter, his name is. And that was one of Mary's dogs. She had a whole lot of dogs. She had dogs and birds, and this was one of her dogs. So that's a dog called Jupiter. And the other one was the elephant. I love the elephant. It's very accurate. And the reason it's accurate is because we had elephants in England. Not native elephants, I hasten to add, but there was a menagerie at the Tower of London from the 1200s onwards. And in this menagerie, what would happen is different kings and princes would send animals as gifts, and they had all sorts there over the centuries. They had elephants and leopards and lions, and even had a polar bear at one time for the King of Norway. And so they knew what an elephant looked like. And I read something, well, I read quite a lot about this. It's such an interesting subject, the Tower of London and its elephants. And when they received one of the elephants, I think they had several over the centuries, somebody gave it as a gift, and they came by boat, and they left the boat at Dover and walked the elephant up to London. So you can imagine what it must have been like to be a medieval villager and somebody walked an elephant through your village. I just can't think what they would have thought of it. And if you see the little picture at the bottom right, that's a sculpture, a sort of metal mesh sculpture of an elephant. And that's what they've done at the Tower of London in the last few years. They've got, as you go around the tower, there's lots of animals interspersed amongst the buildings to sort of talk, indicate about the menagerie. There's a quote here, a comment here from Eva Jane. Seems as Mary arrogance and pride made her reckless and led to her death. Exactly. She made so many bad decisions in her life. She just seemed to wander from bad decision to bad decision, and including fleeing to England wasn't a terribly good idea. But she, there's some dispute about whether she really plotted, to overthrow Elizabeth. But, looking at these example, she certainly was sort of dropping hints, I think, at the very least. Interesting woman, but sad ending in the end. Right, so that's enough of Mary, Queen of Scots. We're going on to another of my favourite people now. Well, definitely one of my favourite people in the V&A. And I think I said at the beginning, this was one of the first things I ever saw when I came to the museum. I came to the museum, decades ago, And I remember in a side corridor, in a cabinet, there was a casket like this. And this is called stump work or raised embroidery. And it may well have been this one, I can't remember, but I remember standing looking at this casket, and that was it. So it had a big effect on me, if it is this casket. They have several caskets in their collection. So anyway, we're going to talk about the casket in a little bit more detail later, but let's first of all talk about who made it and when. So this was made by a young girl called Martha Edlin, and she lived from 1660 to 1725. And she came from a reasonably wealthy family and did this decorative embroidery. And this period, about the sort of 1660 to 1690, was the peak of exquisite amateur English embroidery. It was a sort of high point of it for amateur work, because if you think of Opus Anglicanum, that was professional work. So this is amateur embroidery. And you had to be wealthy to have the time and the money to buy the silks, and the little pearls were embedded also. So it was a rich young lady's pastime, but it wasn't just done for fun. You imagine this girl sitting there working away, doing her needlework. It made her good marriage prospect because she looked biddable. She looked like she could concentrate, focus. She could manage a household. She's sort of had the attention span to manage a household and so on, and was skilled. And sewing was important in a household, at least to lead the servants in the plain sewing that they needed for all the clothing and bedding and so forth. So it was a very, yes, it did help with a marriage prospect. That was very much why they did it. But we're very lucky with Martha Edlin, because she, when she died, she lived into her 60s, and she was it always makes me laugh. When she died, she was a wealthy widow in Pinner. So anybody from London would laugh at that, because Pinner is this really nice middle-class outer suburb of London with sort of mock Tudor houses. But obviously when she lived there, it was probably a village, you know, in the middle of nowhere in a manor house. But why we're lucky is it passed her set of needlework was left to her female descendants, and it stayed in the family for 300 years, this collection, until it came to the V&A. So that's why it's been preserved as a collection, which is fantastic, because, you know, often you've no provenance for things like this, but we know exactly who made this and other pieces. So we will look at the cabinet in a second, but let's first look at what she made in the order she made it. So these, and they're all dated. Often they have her initials on, or they're dated, and we know the dates she was born and died. So these are the first things we have in the collection. So on the left is the full length of the sampler. That's what they call band samplers. So the length of that is the width of a piece of woven material in those days. And that's the sort of detail of it next to it. So the first thing she did that we have is the coloured sampler. And she made that when she was 8 years old. Now, I made a sampler once. I didn't put my age on it, and I certainly wasn't 8 years old. It's not a patch on that. So it was an amazing piece of work for an 8-year-old. And then the following year, when she was 9, she made the white work sampler that's next to it. And this is more complicated because you're drawing out threads and doing this sort of almost like lace sort of work. So she did these when she was 8 or 9, which is fantastic. And at the same time, she was making lots of other little objects. So these were pin cushions. These are absolutely tiny. The little flame one is about the length of your thumb. The pink one's a bit bigger, but they're beautiful. And it's showing all the different techniques she knew. So you have on the left, it's got her initials on. That's a beautiful silkwork piece. The one bottom right is flame stitch or Bargello or Hungarian, Florentine. So it's got lots of names, but that's very typical of that period. And the top one is not embroidery. It's you stick pins into a pin cushion like this, and you stick them in this pattern. And that's what she's done there. And it's all in little verses. So it says, God is a present help at need. It's good to trust in him. Live by faith, joy in hope, it says along the bottom. So it's a very nice little 17th century pincushion. Just move on. So now we've gone through what she did when she was not 8 and 9, 10. And she's 11 years. Oh, can you go back one, please, Manju? That's one. Thank you. So this is, we're now talking about the casket. So she did this casket when she was 11 years old. 11 years old, I can't even believe it. She didn't actually do the woodwork. What you did is you did little panels. Somebody would draw it. You'd have a pattern drawer. The casket's about maybe a foot in width. It's a sort of jewellery box. It's a sort of it's a box for her precious possessions. So she put toys, you know, little miniature letters and notes and diaries, anything she wanted like that in it, her needlework tools. Yeah, she had a lot of inspiration from nature, Minju's saying. This is completely right. It was from books, basically, pattern books that exist. There's a lot of early needlework pattern books in existence. It's amazing. So they would make the little panels and then a cabinet. They would send the pieces to a cabinet maker. And there's a letter from somebody who, a young girl, not her, not Martha, and she said she'd taken nearly 2 years to make it. She was desperate for it to come back from the cabinet maker so she could see what it looked like. That's very sweet. Just quickly, there's 11 secret drawers in this cabinet. So you can imagine they wanted it, you know, like teenagers now with their diaries and so on. They wanted to have their secrets. And there were these pattern books that they use for the inspiration. So you've got the lion and the unicorn, which is the English royal coat of arms on it. And then you've got others. We'll look at the other sides in a second. Her initials were at the top as well. And around the bottom, you've got scenes from the 7 virtues. When I do this talk, when I have done this talk at the V&A, I can never remember all 7. It's like remembering the 7 dwarves. But the 7 virtues are, I've got them written down here: faith, hope, and charity, justice and temperance, fortitude and prudence. So she's illustrating the 7 virtues as she goes round. This was her pastime, Minji. Minji's asking about pastime. This would have been her pastime. The lower castes had no pastime, they just worked. They might have got drunk down the tavern. That'd be about it. You can see the other sides of the casket here. So the back's got a giant squirrel on, which I love. You've got the virtues, you've got a hare, you've got it's a lion and a unicorn, a hare and a hound, a leopard and a camel, and an elephant and a deer, all round. Absolutely beautiful. And this is a lid of the casket. Stump work is raised embroidery. I don't know if you can see it very well, but it's almost 3-dimensional. If you go to the V&A, they've got some other pieces of stump work, not by Martha, in the same cabinet, a picture, a mirror frame and so on. And you can really see it. And there's an unfinished one, which is beautiful because it shows exactly how it was made. But it's very characteristic. This is, she's the figure of music playing the lute. And then you've got the 4 elements, earth, fire, air, and water surrounding her. And her name's on it somewhere on that as well. And you can see the padding. And they put little things like tiny pearls on it. And the person who would have drawn the pattern, they'd pay for a pattern drawer. And they would sell them these little silks and pearls and things as well. Absolutely beautiful. I always hoped to find a stump work box, and I never did. This was the final piece in the collection. It's a jewellery case. She was 13 when she made this. You can see the date on it, actually, 1673. And it opens up, the centre opens up, and there's pink silk, so you put your jewellery inside it. And the bird is a cockatrice, a fantastical, mythical bird. It's very beautiful. So you'd hide all your little sort of jewellery in that. It's a very pretty little piece. And also there were a lot of accessories in the, we won't go into it all, but there were a lot of accessories there. And I like the little swan, but she had little coffee and tea, well, not coffee, but tea sets and things with it. I do like the swan, though. That's one of my favourite pieces. Okay, so that's Martha. I mean, it's a real insight to somebody of her class and social position that's all come down in one family, which is fantastic. And we're now going to look at our last person, or last people, shall we say. What time are we? 41, that's not too bad. Lord and Lady Clapham. Unfortunately, they're not really a lord and lady. They're a pair of dolls. And they were found in a house in Clapham, which is how they got their name. They date from 1690 to 1700. And if you visit the V&A, they're often not there because they're very popular. And when they have exhibitions, they're often sent off to exhibitions. They're obviously in a lot of demand because they're so cute. They were supposed to, they thought to belong to a family called the Cockerell family. And the Cockerells were descendants of the diarist Samuel Pepys. The dolls may not have been for a child to play with. They don't quite know what they were for. There were fashion dolls called Pandoras, but they don't seem to be fashion dolls. They don't seem to be played with for a child. So maybe it was just a doll collector. They're wearing fantastic clothing, and that's their main value, because when you think of, yeah, they're maintained so well, they always have been. When you see portraits, there's not much costume from this era left. There is some, but not so much. And portraits just show the outer layers, whereas these show all the layers, and that's their main importance. So this is Lord Clapham. It looks like Lady, but it's the Lord. And he's got casual wear as well. He's got his formal clothing, and then he's got his casual wear. So the one on the right is he's wearing a banyan, which is a sort of informal dressing gown. So that's his casual when he got home. So he's a sort of dress-up doll, which is quite cute. So these are the sort of layers. There's many pieces. You can go online to the V&A collection and just look at all these pieces individually, which is really nice. So you've got the naked guy almost, and then the chemise. So the white dressing gown, white nightdress is underwear or nightwear. So they call it chemise. And then you've got, this is very typical. This is the start of the three-piece suit. So the grey silver one is a waistcoat. They called it a waistcoat. And then you wore it under the jacket, which was a long coat up here. And that became the three-piece suit. And he had it with breeches as well. But that was the start. And he's wearing a stock, a sort of cravat as well. So he's absolutely of the fashion of the period. He was a fashionable chap. And it's showing the fashions and how they were put together. And you can see all the lovely little accessories really give a great idea, like his sword, little shoes, gloves, his breeches, his hat, and a purse. And it's not the lady's purse. The woman would have a pocket, which we'll see in a minute. It would be a sort of money purse that he would carry with him. So he's a well-dressed man about town, I have to say. And so this is his wife, Lady Clapham. And again, she's got similar. In the center, she's wearing a quilted petticoat. So she would wear various layers of petticoats. It's really useful, these dolls, to be able to see how they're put together. And the quilted petticoat would be warm. So you'd wear those during the winter just to keep the chill off. And these were bought, everything else was made to fit people, but you'd buy the petticoats. It just tied at the waist, so you could buy them ready-made. So, and there's quite a few still in existence. Beautiful design. And then the skirt is Chinese silk as well. It's the same as his banyan. And she's wearing stays, but she was wearing them as a stomacher. You'll see in a minute. So she's wearing them as another layer. So sometimes this layer, the stays was shown, sometimes it wasn't. And here she is on the left, a sort of a final formal outfit. Her earrings, her shoes, and just a close-up of those stays, which is fantastic quality. Wonderful to see. And some of her accessories, a little shoe, little cushion, Chairs, you saw they had miniature chairs, which is original. And the chairs were very uncomfortable, were never padded, so they had lots of cushions those days. Her stockings, her waist, her petticoat, and the one on the right is her pocket. So you would have that under your skirt. And, you know, Lucy Lockett lost her pocket. So people would steal these pockets. So instead of a purse at that stage, she would have this pocket underneath her skirt with a slit in the skirt to get the hand in. I got a question from Minji. Lord and Clap would be handmade as a mature toy making trade. Are they made local from overseas? How much would they cost? Everything was handmade, everything. I don't think it's a toy trade. I don't think it's a toy trade. There was a fashion trade. I mean, it's a long story, but they sent from France. It's a little bit early at this time, but certainly the following century, they sent fashion dolls. Marie Antoinette used to send fashion dolls to England. There was always a history of, you know, you didn't have illustrated fashion magazines very much then. So they often, it might be somebody selling fashions was using them as dolls to show the fashions that they could make. But I think these were just a collector's item, really. That would be my guess. But nobody knows, basically. And just want to quickly show you a couple more things. What's fascinating about her is, it's not a very good picture, but on the right, you can see the back of her headdress. There's little metal spikes. They're covered in material, but the metal spikes sitting up. And that's on the left is Queen Mary wearing one of these headdresses, which were fashionable at the period. And they're called a frelange, and the bits were called fontage. And it's very rare to see how they were held together. So this is very important from a sort of fashion history point of view, to see how they were held together. And this is the most fascinating thing, I think, of it. The little mask on the right is tiny. It would fit on her face. And it's called a Vizzard, or sometimes it's spelt with a Z as well. But it's a Vizzard. And a Vizzard was used by a woman to keep sunburn off when she was traveling, mainly, sometimes for disguise, but mainly for keeping their face pale, which was fashionable, so it showed you didn't have to work in the fields. And the one on the right is an actually full-sized one that they found in Daventry in Northamptonshire a few years ago. And I read at the time, I can't find the reference now, but when they found it there's a description of it. It was found when they were restoring a house of this period, an old cottage, and it was stuffed in the wall. So they stuffed the walls with all sorts of rubbish to fill up the gaps. And this Vizzard was found in it. And it was shown to somebody who remembered the Lady Clapham's Vizzard. That's what I remember reading. And it said, oh, I know what that is. That's a Vizzard. And that's why they kept it, sort of throwing it away. And it's very rare to find one because they weren't expensive items, so they were often thrown away. And the woman often held it in place with a bead. You can see the bead on the big one. So she would hold the bead between her teeth as she went along. So she couldn't talk, basically. It's a ridiculous way of holding it on, in my opinion. But that's what they did. And I'll just show you some quick pictures of women wearing. So these are some illustrations. There are many illustrations of women wearing these masks and Vizzards. Ridiculous. There's a wonderful quote from Philip Stubbs, who said in 1583, when they ride abroad, they have visors made of velvet to cover all their faces, having holes made them against their eyes. Where too they looked so that if a man they knew not their guise and would chance to meet them, would think he'd met a monster or a devil. I love that. And Samuel Pepys, who was related to this family, who was the ancestor, he has a comment, because Samuel Pepys, if you know his diaries, they were usually black or dark colours. Samuel Pepys, every time he was a fashion, he had to be amongst it. He had to maintain fashion. And there's a quote from 1663, And he says he went to the theatre with his wife, and Lady Mary Cromwell, blah, 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 was wearing one, and she put it on in the theatre, which doesn't seem logical, but I suppose she was showing this new fashion, and kept it on all the play, which has become a great fashion amongst the ladies. And then he goes, so to the exchange, which was a shopping exchange, to buy things with my wife, among others, a Vizzard for herself. So the minute peeps have seen it, off they go to follow the latest fashion. That's very typical of Samuel Pepys. Anyway, that's the end of my talk. I think I've got one more slide. Yes. The end of the talk. There's a couple of Mary's little embroideries there. Any questions, please?
So I'm just gonna stop sharing the slides, and thanks for such a fascinating, really interesting history of textiles, your favorites from the Victorian and Albert Museum. So our audience in the group, if you've got any questions for Anne, this will be a wonderful chance to ask her questions. So feel free to either type the questions in the chat box or unmute yourself to ask the questions directly. I will start. And it's amazing behind each textile. It looks beautiful, simple, but there's so much history behind it. How long it took you to undig these histories?
I have to say, thank you, Catherine, by the way. I have to say, the V&A resources are wonderful because every item that's on display, and many that are not, you can go to search the collection online, and they give pictures of some of them. Sometimes the pictures are not very good, some are better. They're still photographing everything. They've got millions of objects in their collection. But they give a PDF file with a lot of information, and that sets me off in lots of directions, what reminds me of things. So it's a wonderful resource. Yeah, I mean, Ava Jane says thank you. And she says she enjoyed it, but she says how sophisticated people were. Yes, that's very much something I haven't really emphasized, but I was thinking with this, it's very right, because when you go to the book of illustrations, that Conrad Gesner book, I couldn't believe how modern looking and detailed, wonderful the illustration. You can look it online, it's online. Amazing detailed illustrations of the natural world. The socks, I mean, 1600 years old socks, and they're, still in good condition. Amazing find.
Was the industry, okay, Evasion has another comment.
Yeah, you see, you're saying that, Ava, but I've found that American scholarship on textiles is very progressive, because I've just been doing a master's, so I've been looking, I keep coming across American articles, and because when when you have 18th, 19th century American culture, there's a lot of textiles. So a lot of people have researched those and have done scholarship on textiles. Things like the patchwork quilts, because there were so few resources, they were treasured. And although you say it is folk art, but a lot of that has led to some very good progressive research on textiles, which is now filtering back to Europe. And I do find that a lot of the American articles on textiles are really interesting.
I'm just quoting Evasion's comment for our YouTube audience. Evasion said, unfortunately, in the States, these kind of items tend to be viewed more as an folk art rather than things actually in the museum. Sandra has a question. Are there any actual visitors in the V&A collection?
No, not on display. I don't think I don't think I've seen one. I'd have to look up. I don't think so. But if you go to if you look up Vizzard with Visard, which is the English spelling, because the other spelling is with a Z, you should find there's a portable antiquities website which gives a whole detailed description. Let me write that down. Their website gives a really good detailed description of that Daventry find of the Vizzard. They weren't expensive things, you see, so they were just thrown away. Like this one was stuffed into a wall when they were looking for odd things to fill a gap in the wall to keep the drafts out, basically. So they didn't, you know, valuable things were treasured, not those. So Boston Museum of Fine Arts is very, very good. I love American quilts, samplers, all that. I mean, American quilts are just heaven. Yeah, I mean, it's Boston Museum's very, very good resource, I have to say. And American museums like the Met, when they photograph things, I have to say, they photograph them in very high resolution, much better than the V&A. So you can really, with some items that have more recently been photographed, you can really get in and see the details of the items, which is fantastic to, you know, to look at the technical details of it.
Was this industry predominantly done by women?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Well, women, there's a whole history of women and textiles. I mean, women were not allowed to join the embroiderers' guilds. So professional needleworkers, once the guilds took over in England, guilds vary from country to country. So some French guilds did allow women in, and there are exceptions. There's a whole lecture just on that. But they weren't allowed to join the guilds, and also the stocking knitters were men. They wouldn't let women in. The embroiderers' guild wouldn't let women in, but women did do this work, and they did it as amateurs. But the amateurs were all upper class because you wouldn't have time. You'd only be able, if you were working class, you could only have free time in the evening, and it would be too dark to work because you couldn't afford proper lighting. So you would, all of those things, and also the materials. Mary was very, Eileen's saying about Mary was skilled, she learned, spent her childhood in the French court, and Catherine de' Medici was her mother-in-law, and Catherine de' Medici, when the Medicis were having a bad period, spent part of her childhood in a nunnery, and she learnt needlework from the nuns. So she passed on these fine needlework skills. Yeah, I mean, amazing. And Martha Edlin, I mean, you know, those things she made when she was 8, 9, 10 years old are just incredible. amazing. And to see them in, you know, they're in a beautiful cabinet in the V&A, well-lit cabinet. It's a pleasure to I always want to bow down before the cabinet when I go there.
We want to bow down to every picture you showed today. It's so sophisticated. There's so much work involved, and contains so much knowledge, not only about the craft itself, but also about nature and illustration. Yeah, it's an incredible space of human knowledge and skills.
Yeah, I think, you know, when you look at I think like the merman and things like that, and they were trying to piece together an idea of the world, and people were coming back from these explorations, and sometimes you know, they come back and they'd have tales of things, you know, and sometimes they'd have dead creatures to show, or live ones. They brought live creatures back. So gradually they were piecing together their view of the world through these things and expressing them in textiles.
So Eva Shen is saying, I'm so grateful for this talk, and I hope Anne will show us more treasures in a future presentation. This is, Eva Shen, this is very typical of Anne's talk. Every time we just want more from her, more talk, please. And so thank you so much, Anne, for a really beautiful and so informative presentation about really culture, materials, object, and history. So a big applause for Anne again. Absolutely, we loved it.
Thank you very much.
Everybody, next week, I don't know how many of you have climbed a mountain Fuji in Japan. If you have, raise your hand. I haven't. So we are very fortunate to have another wonderful presenter from Japan, Kenji. Kenji is a professional mountain guide in Japan for almost 30 years. And due to the pandemic, he created a virtual mountain climbing experience for us to know how it feels and what to prepare if you want to climb the Fuji mountain of Japan. So next week, same time in a week, we'll see you on top of Mountain Fuji. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Have a great Sunday. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Anne.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.